has always been shaped by war. And through the ages, some battles have decided the fate of nations and still affect the way we live today. These are the great battles. This memorial in northern France marks the location of one of the most extraordinary battles of the First World War. At 5:30 a.m. on the 9th of April 1917, the sound of hundreds of screaming whistles filled the air, and 4 Canadian divisions, a total of 30,000 men, leapt into action. The battle for Vimy Ridge had begun. For 2 years, the British and French had tried to take this strategically important summit. But the Germans had turned it into a seemingly impregnable fortress, and thousands had died in vain. But it took the Canadians only a matter of hours to achieve one of the most remarkable victories of World War I. By 1917, the war was a complete stalemate. Trench warfare had become a daily but deadly routine. Any gains made were measured in meters and came at an unbearably high cost. After 3 years, several million men on both sides had been killed. The German defences on the Western Front were 3 lines deep and reinforced with concrete bunkers housing thousands of machine guns. The area between the front lines was a virtual no man's land. After 2 years of fighting, a zone of devastation 10 kilometers wide ran from the Belgian coast to Switzerland. The British and French high commands were obsessed with the idea of a big breakthrough. They sacrificed ever-increasing numbers of men and resources in their futile attempt to punch through the German lines. In a joint effort, the British were scheduled to attack near Arras in the north, followed a week later by a French offensive 130 kilometers to the south. The plan was to catch the Germans in a pincer movement. It was hoped this coordinated attack would force the Germans to divide their resources and give the Allies the victory they so desperately wanted. The Canadians were part of the British First Army and were under the command of a most remarkable individual. Lieutenant General Julian Byng was a complete contrast to most of his fellow officers. He believed the outdated methods of the British Army had strangled any chance of success. Byng took time to listen to the men under his command. As a result, he was well liked by the rank and file. It wasn't long before the Canadians began to call themselves Byng's Boys. During the spring offensive of 1917, Byng and his Canadians were given the job of capturing Vimy Ridge, which lay to the north of Arras. The ridge gave the Germans a commanding view over the entire area. This high ground overlooks the rich coal fields of the Vimy Plain behind me here. The ridge was key to the defense of this industrial heartland, and the Germans were determined to hang on to it. They had spent 2 years making Vimy Ridge into one of the most heavily defended points on the Western Front, and believed it to be totally impregnable. Yet Byng remained confident that with the right approach, his Canadians could take the ridge. The plan was simple. All 4 divisions would rush forward in a series of carefully timed stages under the cover of the greatest artillery bombardment of the war. The assault on the ridge was scheduled to start at 5:30 a.m. The first wave had just over an hour to reach the primary objective, known as the Black Line. 40 minutes later, a second wave would move forward to seize the next objective, the Red Line. The 3rd and 4th Canadian divisions then had to reach the Blue Line just in front of the village of Vimy by 7:05 a.m. The 1st and 2nd divisions had further to go. They were expected to be dug in at the 4th and final objective, known as the Brown Line, by exactly 1:18 p.m. If everything went according to plan, the Canadians would capture the ridge in under 8 hours. But it was very ambitious, and Byng knew that his men would have to be specially trained if they were to stand any chance of success. Well to the rear, away from the eyes and ears of the Germans, the Canadians would be taught new skills. But this part of the story doesn't begin at Vimy. It begins 50 kilometers to the south of the ridge at the Somme. In July 1916, the British launched a massive offensive along a 30-kilometer front. Wave after wave of soldiers were ordered to walk in neat lines across no man's land towards the German trenches. They were given no idea of where to go. It was a disaster waiting to happen. By the end of the first day, 60,000 men were either dead or wounded. It was one of the bloodiest days in British military history. Byng wanted to make sure this massacre would never happen to his men. He sent his most trusted divisional commander, Major General Arthur Currie, to the Somme in order to learn what had gone wrong. Currie learned that the ordinary troops had not been trusted to act on their own initiative. In many places, the officers were killed and the men were left without any knowledge of their objectives. This lack of information had caused the offensive to grind to a halt. However, the high number of casualties at the Somme was a direct result of the Germans' use of a truly deadly weapon. The German Maxim machine gun completely dominated the battlefield. It had an effective range of between 2 and 3 kilometers, and its water-cooled mechanism allowed it to fire 500 rounds per minute. It was completely devastating against tightly packed ranks of advancing infantry. Faced with this terrible firepower, Currie recommended that Byng reorganize his infantry into self-contained fighting units called sections, each consisting of 10 men. Unlike the troops at the Somme, these sections were trained to advance quickly and independently across the battlefield. The Canadians were also trained in the tactics of fire and movement. While one section kept the enemy occupied with heavy fire, the others would sneak round and attack from the sides or rear. But for this tactic to work, the infantry required a weapon that could match the firepower of the German Maxim machine guns. The Lewis was the perfect infantry weapon. The Canadians made sure there was at least one of these machine guns in every section, and they were used to devastating effect. The Lewis machine gun was crucial to fire and movement tactics. You could fire all 47 rounds from this clip in one go, but the gunners were trained to use controlled bursts of about 5 rounds. The Lewis machine gun gave the platoon sections mobile firepower and enabled them to take on heavily fortified enemy positions. The Lewis also had a defensive role. Once the Canadians reached the German trenches, they would be vulnerable to counterattack. Although light enough to carry, the Lewis machine gun gave the Canadian infantry enough firepower to hold on to their objectives until they could be joined by their own heavier machine guns. In the weeks running up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the new infantry tactics were perfected during a series of raids on the German lines. These raids also helped the Canadians to build up a detailed picture of the German defences on the ridge. At Byng's headquarters, a huge model was made of the entire area. Trenches, machine gun posts, barbed wire were all mapped out. Nothing was overlooked. Byng was determined that unlike the men who took part in the Somme offensive, every one of his men would know exactly where to go and what to do during the battle. In the run-up to the attack on Vimy Ridge, Byng told his men, "What I want is the discipline of a well-trained pack of hounds. You find your own holes through the hedges. I'm not going to tell you where they are, but never lose sight of your objective." Never in the history of the British Army had the common soldier been so well informed, nor given so much responsibility. After months of meticulous preparation, the Canadian infantry were ready for their attack on Vimy Ridge. Their new platoon tactics were to have a truly amazing effect on the outcome of the battle. However, there was still one major obstacle they had to overcome if they were to stand any chance of success. After months of special training, the Canadian infantry were ready to play their part in the spring offensive of 1917. But their commander, General Byng, knew that this was not enough to guarantee his men would take one of the most heavily fortified positions on the Western Front. These little pieces of metal are what's known as shrapnel. During World War I, both sides were using the sort of shell that would explode high in the air, showering the battlefield with lead and steel. One can only imagine the horrific injuries caused by these little bits of metal. Byng wanted his artillery to take the German guns out of action before the attack began. But the Germans were hidden in the woods on the far side of the ridge. The Canadians used aerial reconnaissance to overcome this problem. Dangerously exposed 1 kilometer above the battlefield, observers pinpointed the exact position of the German guns and relayed this information to the ground. In the days leading up to the assault on Vimy Ridge, most of the German artillery was destroyed, saving hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadian lives. The other big problem facing the Canadians was how to perfect the creeping barrage. During an attack, the artillery would lay down a curtain of explosions. Closely followed by the infantry, the barrage would gradually move across the battlefield. During the Somme offensive 9 months earlier, the British infantry had repeatedly failed to keep up with the creeping barrage. They were still halfway across no man's land when the barrage passed over the Germans, giving them plenty of time to climb out of their underground dugouts, mount their machine guns, and mow the British down. Byng was determined his divisions wouldn't make the same mistake. Perfect timing was essential. Well behind the front line, the Canadians rehearsed their attack, and the advance behind the creeping barrage was choreographed to the split second. Over and over again, they practiced what became known as the Vimy Glide. With rifles held at high port and bayonets fixed, the Canadians were trained to walk at a precise rate of 100 meters every 3 minutes. At the Somme, many British shells had fallen short and landed on the very men they were supposed to protect. Byng ensured his artillery improved their accuracy and timing. 50,000 tons of ammunition were assembled behind the Canadian lines, feeding over 1,100 artillery pieces. there was one heavy gun for every 15 meters of front line. At the Somme, there had been only one for every 50. The Canadian bombardment of Vimy Ridge began on the 20th of March 1917. Before the infantry had even begun their attack, over 1 million shells had landed behind me on the German lines. At the Somme, thousands of troops were killed and wounded before they'd even reached their own front lines. At Vimy, the Canadians went underground. This is the Grange Tunnel. Throughout the night of the 8th of April, the Canadian soldiers made their way up through this tiny corridor and 11 others like it towards the front line. Less than 1 meter wide and up to 30 meters deep, these tunnels were packed with thousands of troops in full battle dress, quietly waiting for the battle to begin. As 0 hour approached the following morning, the Canadians poured out of the tunnels. In a matter of minutes, the front-line trenches began to fill with troops. When they reached their jumping-off points, they fixed bayonets and waited for the order to go over the top. An eerie silence fell over the battlefield. At 5:30 precisely, the Canadian artillery opened up. The infantry could see the flashes of the guns behind them, then turn and watch the shells exploding along the German lines. Private Lawrence Colpitts of the 46th Canadian Infantry Battalion recorded what happened next. The German trenches became a line of bursting shells, falling so close together you could scarcely see between the flashes. It was a continuous wall of flame and mud. Only seconds after the bombardment had begun, the sound of whistles filled the air, signaling the start of the infantry assault on the ridge. 30,000 Canadians climbed out of their trenches and rushed into no man's land. Just as they had rehearsed, Byng's boys began to advance behind the creeping barrage towards the German lines. The troops worked their way through shell holes and craters. Private George Kettner later said, "We'd scarcely started before we began to have casualties. As we neared the front line, we were greeted with stick bombs, which took effect but didn't stop us. In a moment, we were in the front line. The bay I jumped into was occupied by 4 Germans, all dead." The Canadians reached the Black Line in 30 minutes. With the first objective secure, Phase 2 of the attack began, and the second wave of Byng's infantry moved on through to the next objective. The Canadians' fire and movement tactics kept the advance moving. One by one, they destroyed the German fortified positions that had survived the barrage. The Canadians' second objective, the Red Line, was reached by 6:55 a.m. This was followed by the Blue Line at 11:45, and by 1:30 p.m., 3 of the 4 Canadian divisions had reached their final objective, the Brown Line. The men of the Canadian 1st Division came out of the wood near the village of Farbus and witnessed an amazing sight. The smoke cleared to reveal a wide expanse of open countryside, completely untouched by war. To the east, the Douai Plains stretched out in front of them. The German guns stood broken, deserted by their crews. But on Hill 145, the battle was still raging. This high ground was one of the most heavily defended points on the ridge. The Germans poured out of their deep underground shelters which had protected them from the bombardment. In only a matter of minutes, they were back in their trenches and returning fire. The Canadians began to take heavy casualties. Under this intense pressure, their advance ground to a halt. The only reinforcements available were the men of the Nova Scotia Highland Regiment. These support troops were more used to digging latrines and carrying ammunition. They had absolutely no combat experience. A new barrage was scheduled for 6:45 p.m. But when the time came, it failed to materialize. In an act of extraordinary bravery, the Nova Scotians rushed Hill 145 without any artillery support. Having traded in their shovels for rifles and bayonets, the Nova Scotians took the hill in less than 1 hour. The ridge now belonged to Byng's boys. After months of stalemate, it was a remarkable achievement. As darkness fell on the 9th of April, the Canadians watched from the top of the ridge, while the Germans beat a hasty retreat. It's impossible to say exactly how many Germans died on the ridge. But thousands of them are buried here, just a few kilometers from Vimy, in the largest German war cemetery in the world. Shocked by the speed of the Canadians' victory, many senior German commanders were forced to concede for the first time that the war was now unwinnable. The Canadians had taken one of the most heavily defended positions on the Western Front in under 8 hours. But this accomplishment did not come cheap. 3,500 of Byng's boys lost their lives. Another 7,000 were wounded. There was no great breakthrough during 1917, but the British and French commanders were forced to acknowledge the effectiveness of the fire and movement tactics perfected by the Canadians. It was these tactics that helped break the stalemate of trench warfare and dramatically reduce the senseless slaughter that took place here on the Western Front.